Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on this and other occasions. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And for those watching online, you're reminded you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Leading our discussion this morning is Adam Michel, who is a policy analyst with our Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. He focuses on the economics of taxation, international tax competition, and the federal budget. Before joining Heritage, he was a program manager for the Spending and Budget Initiative at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He has also worked as a research associate at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Please join me in welcoming Adam Michel. Adam?
Thank you all for coming out to hear about tax reform and the business take on what tax reform means for the American economy. We're sort of poised to get tax reform to the president's desk here. With a lot of exciting news has come out in the last couple of weeks. The Senate passed the budget that will hopefully carry tax reform. It looks like the House is going to vote on that on the budget again this coming week, and then we also have the unified framework that came out that lays out the details, or many of the details, of what tax reform could look like, and that provides it's a consensus document that hopefully sets the groundwork for tax reform that can get the economy moving again. There's also been exciting news coming out of the President's Council for Economic Advisors, where we heard there was some analysis showing that the tax reform could raise the average American family's wages by $4,000 through tax reform, through economic growth and extra business investment in the U.S. economy. And so that's the piece that I think I would like to focus on today, is how that business component of tax reform actually drives the additional jobs and wages that can really benefit the American people. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two guests. First to my left is Senator David Perdue, who is a political outsider. He grew up in Georgia, worked his way through Georgia Tech, and spent 4 decades before he joined the Senate in the business community. He's the only Fortune 500 CEO currently in the U.S. Senate, so I'm excited to get his take on how the business community is seeing tax reform. He's sits on the Banking, Budget, Armed Services, and Agriculture committees, and I'm excited to have you here. So thank you for joining us. And next to the senator is Joshua Bolten. Mr. Bolten is the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable, an association of CEOs from leading U.S. companies that generate $6 trillion in annual revenue and employ over 15 million Americans. He has served in the White House under President George Bush in multiple different capacities. He was the Chief of Staff, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, and he was also the Policy Director for the President Bush's presidential campaign. So in complementing the Senator's experience in the business community, I'm excited to hear sort of what you've been hearing from the CEOs and businesses around the country. So with that, I'd like to start, Senator, with a question of where we are currently in the sort of tax reform framework. The Senate, as I mentioned, passed the budget this week, which includes reconciliation instructions, which set up tax reform to actually move through the Senate with just 50 votes. The White House originally said they wanted tax reform in the Senate sort of next month or in the coming months. So I'd like to hear your take on, are we on target for this timeline? After the House passes the budget, what's next?
Well, first of all, let's draw a little perspective on this. This is the first major effort since 1986, on the Tax Simplification Act of 1986. So it's an opportunity to fulfill the president's mission, and that was to grow the economy. But let's back up and look at it a little broader. You know, in my view, the reason you want tax reform is to grow the economy, right? Well, there are a couple of reasons why you want to grow the economy. It's one of the ways you ultimately solve this financial, or the debt crisis, as I call it, longer term. And secondly, we have the lowest workforce participation rate in the last 30 years. So we know that the economy, after 8 years of our slowest economic growth in our history, we need to jumpstart this economy. And there are three ways you do that. One is you push back on regulations. And we saw just a dramatic increase in the regulatory regime here over the last 8 years. And you rationalize your tax structure so that you can be more competitive with the rest of the world. So where we are right now is that we're really paralleling the House. The House is moving right now. I was in a conference with the Speaker of the House this weekend. He's talking about their schedule and our schedule, so that they're trying to get this done by Thanksgiving in the House. We're paralleling right now. We have a meeting with the President in about an hour and a half this morning. We have another meeting this afternoon. So we're doing things differently on this bill than we did for the health care bill that ended up in disaster, in my opinion, earlier this year. So I feel like we've got a shot at getting it done this year, but there's something like 34, I think this is right, 33 legislative work days left in this calendar year. And the reason it's so important is to get it done this year is if you don't get it done this year, I believe you run the risk of disappointing an expectation that's already built into the bond market and the stock market, and that is that something's going to happen this year so that it has some impact on the second half of next year.
And Mr. Bolten, I know that you've been hearing from your CEOs and the business community. Can you speak a little bit to the current disadvantages that they're facing under the current tax system, and sort of maybe why we need this reform effort?
Sure. First of all, thank you for hosting us, and it's a privilege to share the podium with Senator Perdue, who in a very short time has become a leading light. I hesitate to call you a politician.
Oh, thank you.
Because you're not, but he's become a leading. He's become a thought leader in the Senate in a very short time on a lot of important economic issues. And I know, speaking for the 204 CEOs that make up the Business Roundtable, that they're very glad that somebody like Senator Perdue, who was in their ranks, brings his experience to the Senate, especially on an issue like tax reform, which is the most important issue by far for the business community, for the job creators in America. The business community has, for decades, been saddled with an uncompetitive corporate tax code. We currently have when you combine both the federal 35% rate and the average state tax rate, our businesses face a combined 39% tax rate. Most of our companies paying something actually pretty close to that, even when all the deductions and exclusions are taken into account. With that rate, we are by far the highest among developed countries. The average OECD corporate tax rate is 23%. We're all the way up in the high 30s. So everybody else has moved ahead of us, and has every other OECD country, I think except one, has over the last couple of decades competitively lowered their corporate tax rate while ours has remained the same, which means that the United States is not a competitive place to put your company. Ernst & Young did they're called EY now. Ernst & Young, EY did a study that took a look at the effects of our current tax rates on where businesses place themselves. And they found that had we had a competitive tax rate, more like that OECD average rate of 23%, over the course of the last little bit more than a decade, we would have had 4,700 more businesses stay in the United States rather than go overseas. Here's the other part of that equation. Over the last decade, if we'd had that competitive tax rate, we would have had around 200 billion more foreign direct investment in the United States. So the corporate rate alone has really made the United States uncompetitive. It's incented companies to move overseas, um, and it's put a burden not really so much on the CEOs or the shareholders, because our companies are still profitable. The burden falls on the wage earners, because with that high tax rate, our companies are not able to invest as much in the United States as they otherwise would, nor are they able to provide as many jobs as they otherwise would. The senator made reference to the very sluggish and historically anemic recovery that we've had since the 2008 recession. You have to put a lot of that problem right at the doorstep of our tax code. And if we are going to ignite this economy, get us out of that 2% growth range back up to a more normal range of 3%, tax reform is the one and only mechanism that's really going to make a difference in jump-starting this economy, not just for the next few years, but over the long term.
Thank you. Senator, I know that you've had experience with some of these running company that has had these problems of thinking through whether or not to invest in the United States or elsewhere, and the consequences of the tax code. Can you maybe elaborate on some of your experiences of how this holds back American business?
Well, yeah, and I think Josh said it best. I mean, the corporate tax rate and the lack of competitiveness really is a penalty on top of the American worker. And I saw that directly running a couple of businesses to show you how archaic our tax system is and how it's not a level playing field on two levels. On one level, within the United States, just among corporations here, the two big businesses I was blessed to be a part of, one's effective tax rate was 37% and the other one was 17%. And so that's not, that's picking winners and losers, and it's an amalgamation of 100 years of incentives. These aren't loopholes. These were things that were voted on by Congress to incent businesses and individuals to invest in certain ways to get certain results. And so in my career, at these companies, we would make in X number of countries and we would sell in Y number of countries. And so each one of those intersections gave you an opportunity for a transfer price. And that transfer price created your tax liability in aggregate. So what I saw was we were building up profits overseas, U.S. profits. We were a U.S. corporation, but we were building up profits overseas. And to bring them back, we would have paid a double tax effectively, or bring it back at 35% versus leaving it over there an effective rate of 22 or 23%. And in some countries, it's dramatically lower than that. Ireland's like 12%. And then some people play the intellectual property box game and all of that. But in my experience, what it was it kept me from investing where I wanted to invest, and that was here in the United States, in plant and equipment, in training, and helping people to change from one type of job to another type of job, which is retraining, which is a big need right now in the United States as we go from an industrial age to an information age. And that I would contend over the last 20 or 30 years, that's been a huge miss in terms of corporate America, because a lot of this profit's been left overseas. So having lived that, I know that puts us at a tremendous disadvantage with other companies in other countries. And the second big disadvantage of that, having a high corporate tax rate in tandem with a repatriation tax, it puts our U.S. companies on the wrong side of a merger and acquisition pressure. I've lived that personally. And so what happens is a U.S. company domiciled in the U.S. paying 37% effective rate is very vulnerable to a corporation in a country that's paying an effective rate of 23%. I call that tax arbitrage. So they can come in, make an acquisition offer a price that the CEOs and the leadership will have to look at seriously, and they'll turn around and pay for that acquisition primarily with a tax difference between moving the corporate headquarters. We see examples of that. Burger King sold to Jimmy's in Canada. We see that the beer industry in St. Louis is predominantly owned by Belgians and Brazilians. It's happening every day. There are ag companies right now being discussed. So this is a major problem of our competitors and the people who bear the brunt of that. And Josh pointed this out very well in the first comment, and that is it's the American worker that's put it at a tremendous disadvantage because of these two archaic tax rules.
So following up on that, you're talking about moving our system away from what's currently a worldwide tax system to a territorial system is one of the changes, along with pairing that
I
with
say it a little simple,
with-
more
yeah.
simple. It's a repatriation tax. If I bring it back, I'm not a CFO, but my financial officers kept telling me, oh, we need a territorial system. Well, it's just a repatriation tax that we want to eliminate.
Mhm.
So that if I pay the 23% over there and I bring it back, I don't want to have to pay the differential here. That's a punitive tax versus what I'm having to compete with around the world.
Leveling the playing field
Right.
for American-based
Right.
businesses. So that change, there's a discussion of deemed repatriations, that money that's currently overseas. There's a discussion of leveling a tax on all of that money that's currently locked overseas, and then moving to the system that we no longer have the repatriation tax. Is there? Do you have a perspective on what that transition should look like? What the rate on the repatriated money should be, and whether it should be two rates, or there's lots of moving pieces there?
Well, I'm smiling because I think I know the position of the VRT and a lot of the companies that are his members. I know my opinion is that originally that thought of deeming, and again, you're penalizing people who have followed the law. It's like the '86 tax law did not grandfather a lot of investments that had been made at that point, and it changed entire industries, particularly the real estate industry. Today, what deeming does is it allows the government to reach in and grab a tax, a bundle of tax dollars is fundamentally what it does. And originally it was thought of that we had to use that to pay for the elimination. Well, this is a scoring problem that we have in Washington of how the financial models are run. And they're saying that even though you don't collect a lot of money today under repatriation, that if you eliminate the tax, the way the models work is that you are now losing revenue. And so to deem that would offset.
Even though it's tax you'll never collect.
You'll never collect it.
Yeah.
So this is the oxymoron of the quote financial models. And one of the differences here, and I should call this out, and what gives me hope that we'll actually get this tax deal done, is that we're actually using the static score. Now that's a new term for me. I didn't know what that was 3 years ago. But that just means you're not taking into account what Josh mentioned, and it is the dynamic impact of growth by making a tax change. And let me give you an example. If you eliminate the repatriation tax, let's say you bring $1 trillion back. Well, that's equity. That's profit. That's equity. And so if I bring that back, and this is what we were fighting at the company that I was running, was, well, that's equity. We're going to lever that up, put leverage on it maybe 3 or 4 times as it gets invested. So the models don't take that into account either. And that's a huge deal. Then the second thing is, as you invest that, over time you create profits. We pay dividends, those dividends get reinvested back in the economy, but you also make profits that you'll reinvest in training and building equipment and all that. And so that doesn't get counted. So this is a geometric progression of growth based on a one-time transfer of profit.
Mr. Bolten, I know that you've recently put out a survey of your CEOs, sort of asking them what tax reform could do for them, sort of what changes would you make if tax reform went through? I'm sure this is one of the things that they highlighted. Is there can you tell us what you're hearing?
We surveyed all of our CEOs. We got a high response rate back, and the results I think were pretty remarkable. We asked the CEOs, what would you do with hiring and capital spending if a tax bill went through that resembles basically the agreed framework that's now on the table? 76% of our CEOs said that they will hire more. This isn't sort of a theoretical, oh, we think this is good for the economy and employment will increase. 76% of our CEOs said they, in their own planning, will hire more people if this tax reform goes through. We asked about capital spending. 82% said if the tax reform of the kind that's on the table now went through, we would invest more in the United States, in plant and buildings and equipment. So overwhelming majorities of the CEOs of 204 of America's biggest companies are going to hire more, and they're going to do more capital investment here in the United States if a tax bill like this goes through. Now, there's a flip side to this story. because we also asked the question the other way. And we said, what will happen if the kind of tax reform that's on the table today either fails to go through or is long delayed? What will you do with your own planning? And a majority of our CEOs said they will have to go back in and take planned hiring off the books, and they will take planned capital investment off the books. So there's a big upside to tax reform succeeding, Senator, when you and your colleagues
No pressure.
get it done. But there's a big downside too, because many of them have already baked into their plans increased hiring and increased capital spending based on the expectation that this kind of tax reform will go through. So there is pressure on Senator Perdue and his colleagues, because if the tax reform fails or is long delayed, there's going to be hiring and spending that comes off the books, and that will have a real impact on the real economy.
Senators, that pressure that you guys are feeling, is there a sense that this needs to get across the finish line soon?
Yeah, but it's not what it should be. I mean, I'll just say that directly. The sense of urgency in Washington is not the same sense of urgency I lived with for 40 years in the real world. It's just not. I mean, if you didn't get it done as fast as your competitor was, I mean, I had to compete with a couple people a couple entities that people might know. I mean, I competed with a little company called Nike for a while, you know, and they were good. They were really good. And we did pretty well against them. And then I had to compete against another little company you may have heard called Walmart at a time when they were growing about 10% a year. So this is not something you think about theoretically. It's something you do like breathing. I mean, it's just done. Well, here, it's not done that way. So the sense of urgency is not, in my opinion, what it really needs to be. We should have done tax first thing this year, in my opinion. But I'm just one senator. Now that we are where we are, I'm one of the minority guys, at least, in the Republican Party. I really don't like doing this with reconciliation. But we're doing it that way. It will be in regular order. It will go through the Finance Committee. There will be amendments. So this is going to be one of the things that they talk about as regular order. So there is pressure here. My point is that Americans, and particularly Congress, tends to work better in a crisis for whatever reason. At least they get something done. The problem is what they get done is not a good product in every case compared to what they could do if they were doing it in a more judicious manner. So I think for given the fact that we did not get health care passed, means that I think on the Republican side there's even more pressure to get this done. I think there's some Democrats actually who right now are saying the right things, that they may even vote for this bill as well. And when you look at this pro-worker intent, and again, we got to make sure that all the things are done here, but there are three pieces of this, and there's Democratic support for a lot of this. On the corporate, there are three pieces. First, the repatriation tax we talked about. Second, the corporate tax we've talked about. The third is the individual, and the president said he wants to make a significant tax cut for the middle class. Well, we have to make sure his words are translated into action in the reality, and it's very complicated given the archaic nature of all the deductions that we have in this structure. It's really not easy to do that. So yeah, we're feeling the pressure, and I think it's a good thing, frankly.
It's good to hear. You talked about how this benefits workers, and the investment from the business community is part of that. The connection that I think is often lost is how that investment and the hiring of additional people is what then drives up wages through as you need to hire more people into the labor market and induce people to work more hours or change jobs. That's what ends up turning into this wage increase that the president keeps talking about, and that's an important part of the story, is how do we get investment and jobs and then translates to higher wages, and that feeding through those cycles is often hard to convince people that all those steps happen, but that's sort of what we've been seeing time and time again, and across countries and across states. When we lower the corporate tax rate and make these changes, it's a benefit for workers. So it's good to hear that we're moving in the right direction. We talked about this international component and the repatriation tax. There's also mention in the framework of international minimum tax or other changes on the international side. I'd love your opinion from both of you on sort of what other anti sort of base erosion rules you think are on the table that might be part of the package, and the maybe pros and cons of what's being discussed.
I think I'll let the director of OMB take a shot at that first.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Look, there's a lot of stuff that's on the table that we've heard about. A minimum tax is on the table. Limiting the interest deduction is on the table. There are a variety of other things on the personal side. The state and local tax deduction is on the table. So these aren't particularly welcome. No offset is particularly welcome. But the CEOs that I represent understand that that's a necessary part of tax reform. That you're going to need some offsets if you're going to substantially lower the rate, if you're going to shift, as the senator was describing, to a real territorial system that doesn't have a repatriation tax in it. Then you're going to need some offsets in the tax codes, and the ones I mentioned are the ones that are most prominently featured. And the CEOs, they'll come out differently depending on how the offsets come out. The senator mentioned that he was in one business that was paying a 37% effective rate, another one was paying a 17% effective rate, and we have companies all in that range in the Business Roundtable. But they are unanimous on this point, and that is that all of those moving pieces, if can and should be moved, if the product is a substantial lowering of our overall rate to a competitive level and a shift to a territorial system of taxation. They won't do equally well under that. Some will experience a tax increase, maybe even. Some will experience a tax cut. But the important part is that we will have a competitive system here in the United States where you're not penalized because you happen to be headquartered in the United States, either because you're paying that high tax rate or because you can't bring your overseas profits back into the United States and invest them properly.
Yeah, let me add a little, I agree with everything that was said there. Every CEO that I've talked to wants to push the rates as low as we can, corporate rates, at the expense of the deductions. I mean, they'd love to see all the deductions, go away, but you got to lower the tax rate as well. And so it's the effective rate that they're worried about. And look at the U.S. effective tax rate. Even with the effective rate, we're still much higher than the rest of the world. So we have a lot of room. The good news is that we know that when we do this, what results will happen. In the UK, back in 2009, they reduced their corporate rate from 30 to 20, and they eliminated their repatriation tax. Well, what happened was now we have companies being purchased in the U.S. moving their corporate headquarters to London. And when I lived in France in the in the 70s, London was the most expensive place in the world to do business. But because they've changed their structure, now it's an attractive place to put a corporate headquarters. But let me put this in perspective. Today in our U.S. economy, it's about a $19 trillion, $20 trillion economy directionally. We have about $6 to $7 trillion of capital not at work in our economy today. At the same time, we have the largest Fed balance sheet in history, really, $4.5 trillion. And it really hasn't brought a lot of growth. You heard the director talk about the last decade has been this recovery has been the weakest recovery in our history. And regulation has a part of that, but the tax code is just an insidious drag on that potential growth. Those two things have caused $6 to $7 trillion you have to not be at work in the economy. You've got the Russell 1000, many of whom are his members, some of whom are his members, have one of the largest liquidity positions in history. You've got small banks and community banks and regional banks who have nothing to do with the 08 recession or 08 financial banking issue because of additional reserve requirements. They've got large balance sheets as well, and then you got this unrepatriated profit. So we believe that if that money had been invested over here, the number of companies, you mentioned the number, it was a staggering number, would still be in the United States. Well, those are American jobs. And if those companies were still here, just like our decision to invest in the U.S. or invest where the money was simply included things like training, retraining, development cost of our workforce. America has a lot of advantages. One of the biggest advantages, we've got one of the best workforces in the world. I can speak to that because I've lived in Asia and lived in Europe, and this workforce is very unique. It's innovative, it's self-starting, and they just get the job done. But we've got to take the burden off of them. And the tax burden right now is one of the things holding us back.
So this talk of offsets and what else is sort of in the unified framework. I know there's the Senate has a $1.5 trillion reduction in the revenue baseline, and that's the sort of box that we need to fit tax reform into now. Is there what's sort of your take, Senator, on that process of actually fitting this full tax reform package into the reconciliation instructions and what those trade-offs are going to look
This
like?
is what happens in a political environment. I'm learning. I've only been doing this a couple of years, but people use numbers very loosely in this town. It's incredible. 1.5 trillion is the target, and that's a static number. And in the scoring world in Washington, it's a static number. It has no impact of any growth or any secondary benefit. It's just the cost. And so you'll hear the opponents of tax revision scream about, oh, you're adding to the debt, you're adding to the debt. Well, in my experience in these turnarounds, and that's clearly what this is, the slowest growth in American history is where we are right now. If you want to make a turn out of that's a turnaround. And I've been through some pretty big, messy turnarounds. I was never able to cut my way out of it. I was never able to raise prices, which is the parallel of a tax increase, to solve it. The only way we were able to dig out of that was to grow out of it. Now, growth in our American economy won't solve a $20 trillion debt, okay? But it will absolutely help. And there are 4 or 5 other things that we need to do, including saving Social Security and Medicare to do that. But right now, what we have an opportunity to do is to absolutely get a return on whatever deficit spending is necessary to get competitive with the rest of the world. Let me give you an example. If you lower the corporate tax rate, eliminate the repatriation, which I argue we're not collecting anything on anyway, and you lower the individual tax, you're going to get a stimulative impact on the economy. We don't know how much, but we know it'll be something. If you grow the economy 0.4 of 1%, it's less than 0.5%. You more than pay for the 1.5 trillion. I'm not saying that this thing's going to cost 1.5. It might cost a little less, it might cost a little more, but I know if you do the things we're talking about, we'll grow the economy more than 0.4% higher than what we've been in the last 8 years. There's no doubt about that. And the biggest beneficiary of that is the American consumer and the American worker. I can't say that too many times. It sounds like we're going to give more dividends to the shareholders. Well, that may happen, but that gets reinvested as well. But in the meantime, I know in my experience at Reebok, I would have been training workers at Dollar General. I would have been training workers. That's a big part of what we don't talk about in this equation.
Thank you. That's the sort of feedback of the growing economy, raising wages is sort of what we keep coming back to, and that's I think that's important. I've got one more question, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. So if you have anything, be thinking of it. But Mr. Bolten, I know that we've seen tax reform sort of come through Washington before multiple times. It's been 30 years since the last time we really saw a full reform. Is there any lessons that we can learn from past reform efforts, things that you're sort of maybe mistakes you're seeing us repeat again, or things you're optimistic about that sort of shows us that this reform effort may actually sort of get all the way across the finish line?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about it. You'll be very surprised to learn, but despite my youthful appearance, I was a staffer on the Senate Finance Committee in 1986, which was the last time that tax reform was done. That's not 30 years ago, that's 31 years ago, the last time we did it. And in 1986, there was a confluence of events that actually made it possible to do tax reform in the way that the senator was saying he'd prefer, which was on a bipartisan basis. We had a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House, and the stars aligned in a funny kind of way only after they had experienced, the chairman for whom I was working had experienced complete disaster with the tax reform plan he was originally pursuing. Very different political environment today, and it's a shame that we don't have the opportunity for the kind of bipartisan buy-in that would be helpful on this occasion. But the stars are aligning in this respect, and that is that we have a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, the leadership of which all agree on basically the same outline of a tax reform bill. We also have a situation in which the people in this country know that we are underperforming our potential very badly. And I think the senators' constituents will understand, and Senator Perdue's in particular, because he's a very good communicator on these issues, that one of the reasons this country has been underperforming at least since the Great Recession of 2008, but well before that as well, is that we have an uncompetitive tax code. It's uncompetitive with respect to companies that operate just here in the United States. It's especially uncompetitive with companies that are now actively engaged in selling to the 96% of the world's population that happens to live outside the United States. And I think folks have really developed an understanding that that needs to change in order to unleash the potential in this economy. And so I am incautiously optimistic at this point about the prospects, thanks in large measure to the good leadership that this tax reform issue has on the Hill.
Is there anything else that we didn't touch on you'd like to add before I throw it open to questions?
Time is of the essence. This needs to get done.
With that, is there any questions from the audience?
David Burton with the Heritage Foundation. I would like to ask about the tax treatment of capital investment or capital cost recovery. The framework provides 5 years of expensing, which of course would lower the cost of capital and tend to promote investment. Unless I misremember, I don't believe either of you gentlemen talked about capital cost recovery and expensing. I'd be interested in your views about the likelihood of it being included in the final legislation and its importance to the economy.
Well, something like 80% of all employment in the United States is with companies that employ fewer than 200 people. So the 179 expensing for smaller business, I think, is a large part of the decision-making of how those companies form capital. With larger corporations, it's not as clear to me in terms of that. And I get a little bit concerned when what Washington needs to do is basically make sure we create a level playing field, but this incenting business gets convoluted over time. So I think there's a good chance that this 5-year expensing idea will probably be in the end result. It's not that expensive. It does help generate capital. But remember, the $6 to $7 trillion I'm talking about is in existence. If we just do a couple of things, I would love to see the reserve requirement changed back on small banks and regional banks. I think that would have a tremendous impact on capital formation for these small businesses. That's a huge deal. That's not part of this conversation. Eliminating the repatriation tax will really help a lot of 199 players, the larger corporations. But surprisingly, I've got some people within my state that have unrepatriated profits overseas and employ 750 people. And so I think that this idea of capital formation, we need to take the things that are getting in the way of that and eliminate it. And this, I think, will probably stand the test of the next few weeks and remain in the final bill.
Peter Summer with Capital Intel. On the repatriation tax, there's a debate or a controversy that this will be used for companies just to do sheer buyback or the tax rate. What do you think? Will you have a 0% rate on the repatriation of U.S. corporate taxes? And can this be used in the President Trump's $1 trillion infrastructure fund and maybe Puerto Rico?
You know, I have a very strong point of view on this, and a lot of people disagree with me, so here we go. I think it should be zero. You know, I want you to pay, I want a corporation to pay that tax that they should be paying wherever the money is made. But let's talk about if it comes back and they do a share buyback. What happens to the share buyback? They're buying shares from people who own the shares. Or what happens to the capital when they are giving that back? They're going to go buy other shares. It's going to get pretty much recirculated in the economy. Same thing with dividends, except in dividends, you're going to get taxed again. You're going to get double tax. So I take a pretty hard stance on that. The deeming, I don't even like the deeming because you're penalizing somebody for obeying the law up to now. And so to take money from there and use it for here is kind of how we got in $20 trillion of debt, to be honest with you. And so whatever the needs are, whether it's hurricane victims in Florida, hurricane victims in Texas, or hurricane victims in Puerto Rico, every dime that we're going to give those folks, every dime is borrowed money, no matter what you do with this repatriation tax. That's how serious this is and how far down this rat hole we've gotten. But it's further than that. Every dime we give to our military, every dime we give to our veterans, and every dime we spend on every project that we have in discretionary domestic spending is by definition borrowed. I can go through that in more detail offline, but the reality is the last 8 years, and it's projected the next 10 years, that about a third of what we spend is borrowed, and our discretionary spending has now declined as a percentage to about 25% of what we spend. And so do the math. Every dollar we collect in taxes, and by the way, we collected more tax last year than any other year in our history. And that was true the prior year, and it was true the prior year before that. So I don't believe our problem here is that we don't collect enough tax. Our problem here is our federal government has grown from $2.4 trillion in 2000 to almost $4 trillion last year in constant dollars.
Can I put my budget hat on and say amen to all of that? We are facing a long-term fiscal crisis in this country, and we are facing a short to medium-term growth crisis in this country, not because we are undertaxed. In fact, we're facing a growth crisis in part because we've been overtaxed in an uncompetitive way. But we are facing a spending crisis in this country, and there is no amount of taxing that can be done on this economy that could possibly address in any serious way the long-term fiscal problem that this country has. So we should be doing a competitive tax reform, make our tax code competitive, raise the money that we should be raising from that tax code, and then we need to solve the fiscal problem on the spending side, which is principally a problem of entitlements, as the senator was alluding to.
Good afternoon. Michael Maybach with Heritage Foundation. Thank you for doing this. It's my understanding, but perhaps you can clarify it, about 60-70% of employers are LLCs, partnerships, subchapter S corps, and not corporations as Josh represents. So how does this tax plan treat those employers?
Well, what you're referring to is if you lower the corporate tax rate from 35 to 20, which is in the current thought process now, you have to adjust the what we call the pass-through definition, the LLCs, the sub-S's, and so forth, because that's where a lot of the employment in the United States is actually housed. And I think we can do that if you get the rate somewhere in the 4 to 5% differential range from what we can see. But there's a caveat in there, and we have to be very careful about this. Under the Camp proposal, 70% of the profit made by a sub-S corporation was going to be deemed as income. Well, I disagree with that. I mean, I've run a sub-S. I've had an LLC personally, so I would take issue with that. In some cases, that might be the right way to do it. Most cases, it's not. And I think we have to find a way to fairly equate what part of profit is real income. And there are ways to do that. We have limits on executive pay and executive compensation expensing. There are limits on that. There are ways that we can do that. So that would be my only caveat to that.
Hello, my name is Eric Landrum. I'm an intern here at the Heritage Foundation. You stated quite well the serious implications of this tax reform, both the economic implications and the political implications for the Republican Party in 2018 if it were to fail. But I think just as importantly are the implications for the lines upon which the Senate will be divided for the remainder of this term and in the near future for President Trump's first term and possible second term. Namely, assuming that Senate Minority Leader Schumer forces all the Democrats into a single block, even the moderate red state Democrats, into voting against this in those desperate times, desperate measures, right? When push comes to shove, do you think this tax reform can pass through the Senate only with Republican votes?
Absolutely. But you don't sound like an intern. It's a great question. No, without being flippant, I think that's the question of the day. I think the Republican Party has to decide and prove to America that we can govern. I don't think there's anything less. I mean, I think that's the challenge before us. I mean, yeah, it's a thin margin. We have 52, okay? Sometimes I wonder if we had 48 or 49. I'm not sure, but 52. And so, look, they all vote independently, but here's one where I know that what we're talking about here, becoming competitive, protecting American workers, being fair to American consumers, all of this is a Democratic ethos. So there are half a dozen or so, I believe, Democrats that, without the pressure you're talking about, would probably vote for this bill. There are a lot of political reasons why 10 of them should, because 10 of them are running for re-election right now in red states, some where the president won by 40 points. So there's that pressure. But then the pressure that I've witnessed inside the Senate itself offsets that. So the question is really, under reconciliation, can we produce 50 votes in the United States Senate, assuming the vice president would vote for this? I'm optimistic, only because we're dealing with the things now at an earlier stage from the time we'll get the bill than we were in healthcare. And those are the only two big ones I have to compare. And so the things that we have to get over are much smaller in reality than what we had to do, I think, to pull everybody together on the healthcare deal. Healthcare, it was about process. When we're doing regular order here, we will have Democratic amendments. We will have them in committee. It will be voted on in committee. It will be marked up in committee, and then it will go to the floor, and we'll have amendments on the floor. So we'll get a lot of dialogue on this. And you know what? We'll probably get some ideas that will pass coming out of that. To be included in the bill. So I think this is a challenge for the Republican leadership, Republican membership in the Senate to get this done, because we see all the reasons why. If you're a capitalist, now not everybody in the United States Senate is a capitalist, surprisingly, but if you believe in the capitalistic system, you have to believe that smaller government, limited government, is the way to thrive. And what we've done here is, as a party, watch this, we had one Republican president and one Democratic president over 16 years, and that's when we went from 2.4 to 4 trillion. So both parties are guilty in this. There are no innocent parties in this spending game up here. But we have an opportunity now to get back to what we know works, and that is economic opportunity for everybody. Well, if you get regulations pulled back, you get taxes competitive, that creates opportunity. You give American workers the opportunity, and I guarantee you we'll win that one. The second one is you have to talk about fiscal responsibility. This idea of borrowing a third of what you're spending, I mean, that's nonsense. You can't do it in your personal life. You can't do it in business. How in the world do we get away with it? We won't be able to get away with that forever. And then all of that puts pressure on the one thing that I think drives this whole argument, and that is, are we going to be a state-driven society, or are we going to be an individual-driven society? And that's the individual liberty that we tend to sort of forget about in these scoring conversations up here. So as an intern, I welcome your help, because you're going to be the one that 40 years from now, you'll be sitting up here trying to answer questions why this hadn't been dealt with in 40 years.
I hope not.
I hope not, too.
You speak about sort of regular order and how tax reform is going to move through the Senate. Are there things that you're keeping your eye on, things you maybe would like to see change from the framework, or places you think maybe the Senate and the House may differ at the end of the process?
Well, because we're paralleling, and because the president, and you have to give the president and Paul Ryan and Ms. McConnell credit here that the group of 6 that have been working as Finance Committee and the House and the Senate and the White House have all been working here in conjunction with each other. So what's going in the House bill is not that far away from what we're talking about in the Senate, and we are paralleling that behind the scenes. So even though I'm not a fan of reconciliation, given that's the way we're going to do this, we will get a lot of Democratic input. We're getting some of that now. The pushback around the 25% bracket, you got to make sure that if you eliminate state and local tax, then in every state these people are going to get a tax break. So you got to work. You got to, as Paul Ryan says, you got to turn the dials. That's what I'm focused on. You start turning the dials, as you know, from your days in OMB, and certainly as Chief of Staff, you can get out of tune very quickly. It's a tough thing to do. The other thing that I'm really concerned about, and this is one that bears watching, and that is how serious these politicians are going to be in terms of staying true to pushing as hard as they can on corporate welfare and getting the tax rate as low as we can on the corporate side. And then the third thing is being sure that up and down that the middle class gets the benefit of this effort on the individual side.
Thank you.
There's been talk about getting rid of the state and local.
We can hear it.
Yeah, just go for it.
You want to make a run at that?
I'll make a run at it after you've.
Yeah, I think it will. I think honestly, it's a well transfer from some states to other states. Why should a couple who have 2 children, one's in San Francisco and one's in Peoria, Iowa, not pay the same amount of federal income tax with the same income, same deductions, same house, same everything? Why should they pay different amounts to the federal government? They shouldn't, in my opinion.
I cannot improve on that, so I won't try.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, thank you for joining us and sort of talking through all the implications for tax reform for the business community and how it will benefit workers. I think I'll be excited to watch the process as it moves forward. And thank you both for your time, and thank you for the work you have done and will continue to do on as this process moves forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.